All right, hello, and let's just go over this chapter 6, supply, demand, and government policy. We're going to use our supply demand model, okay, to see if the government intervene in this market. We draw our equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. What happened to the equilibrium if the government imposed, for example, tax or manipulate the market for prices. All right. All right. Price control is when the government or policymakers believe that equilibrium market price of that good or a service is unfair to some group of buyers or sellers, and it can generate inequalities. And they think by imposing a ceiling or floor on that market, they can kind of bring equality into this market for this particular good. Okay, either they set up a ceiling that nobody can charge more than this, or they set up a floor. Nobody can pay workers less than this. That's just for the price uh, minimum wage, and this one for price ceiling. Ah, and another reason for government to intervene is uh, taxation, to raise money for public purposes. Okay, let's look at these two tools that the government use to manipulate the markets. Control the price. One called price ceiling, that governments think it is too much and he want to help the buyers, okay, of this market. Okay, we put the price in here, quantity in here, okay, then the market equilibrium, these are the buyers, these are the sellers. The market price is whatever it is, let's say $3,000 for 2-bedroom apartment in California, and government thinks, well, let's say 2-3 million people renting this apartment. Okay, we know these sellers, they cannot be in because their cost doesn't cover what they get from the market, and these buyers are out too because they cannot afford it, they're not willing to pay that much. Then using this many demanders, this many suppliers, they come to equilibrium, which is 3 million of. Now, if the government comes and says, okay, this price is too high, I'm going to put a ceiling on it. This ceiling, to be effective and binding, it has to be set below the equilibrium price. Okay, if it's set up above the equilibrium price, like $4,000, it doesn't make sense. It's not effective because the landlord just said, well, we're not charging him $4,000. We're just charging him $3,000. But if the government put $2,000 ceiling on this market, then it's going to be binding or effective. Okay, we're going to talk about it. All right, how about price floor? Price floor is the other way around. Let me just raise this here. Okay, is mostly imposed on the sellers. In this market, the sellers going to be the laborers. Okay, let's say this one is supply demand market for labor. We put wages here, we put labor here. And who are the demander of the labor for this market? Firms, manufacturers, right? Who are the suppliers of the labors? They are households, the workers. Let's say the wages come out like uh, $7 an hour. Okay, that's for low skilled workers, maybe 20 some million people in USA economy under this wage here. Okay, maybe 3 million, I mean 20 million people working in all these low skill uh, job, you know, fast food places, grocery stores, and so on. But it's so low that they cannot afford to live. Okay, with the inflation going up these days and prices are higher, they come up with about $300-400 a week. But maybe a single mom, single dad, and with the kids, they can't afford it. Government come for good reason to help these people. You're going to set up a wage, which is called a minimum wage, above this equilibrium. That's going to be binding or effective. Well, if you set it up for $15 an hour minimum, nobody can charge or pay this supplier of this commodity or service, which is labor. Demanders are the firm. Okay, is created surplus of the labor. Okay, these people that buying this labor, they're going to lay them off. They're not going to hire. More people want to come to this market to take advantage of this $15 an hour, but they can't find the job. That's what we're going to talk about these two markets. How price ceiling affect market outcomes is not binding if it's set below the equilibrium price. Okay, again, this is the equilibrium price. The price is not going binding is it set below the equilibrium price. It doesn't make sense. No, let me take it back. If you set above the equilibrium price, okay, it's not binding. It's not going to make any sense. Okay, is binding when it's set below the equilibrium price and it causes shortage. Okay, let me just draw one more here. Okay, is going to create a shortage. All right, that's the supply, demand, market equilibrium is here. The government set a ceiling under the or below the equilibrium price, which is bonding. Nobody can charge more than this. That's why we call it ceiling. Then it created shortage. There's more demand for this product than supply, okay? And this is going to be the shortage. And this two panel here shows the binding price ceiling, which is here, binding, okay, and not binding because it's set above the equilibrium price. When it's binding, it causes shortage. And rent control is a popular example of this case that happened in 60s, 70s in California. Everybody moving out there causes big shortage of housing, and Governor Brown back then tried to help the needy and impose a price ceiling on rent. And the critic says that that was highly inefficient way to help the needy, the poor, to raise their standard of living because it causes shortage and actually didn't create any housing for them. Okay, in the short run versus long run, the short run, the shortage was not as severe because people didn't have no choice. They have to stay in there for a few months until to find a place to live. And supply of the housing was pretty much vertical, in short run. In a few months, they cannot bring houses right away. But in the long run, those two curves get more flat, which is more elastic and causes severe shortage, which is still going on in California and New York and so on. How about the price floor? It affects the market outcomes. If it's set below the equilibrium price, it's not binding. Okay, the minimum wage we just talked about, right? That's just for the labor market. The wages this year, if nothing intervene, 20 million people, working at Walmart, grocery stores, fast food places, getting paid $7 an hour. The government comes and says, well, we've got to pay them at least $15. Okay, that's the classical right-wing economists believe. This which causes a surplus of the labor. We call it surplus, or unemployment we call it. Okay, this many people want to come work with that price. These people didn't want to work for $7 an hour. Okay, now they do because they said, well, the government said they have to pay us $15. How about these people that hiring? They're going to lay off some of those people, and they're not even hiring. Okay, and it causes surplus or unemployment. And in order to be binding constraint, okay, to create that surplus, it has to set up above the equilibrium price. Okay, some sellers are unable to sell what they want, okay, which is the laborers, and rationing mechanism of the market is not working and is not desirable. Okay, that panel shows when the price floor is binding, it has to be set up above the equilibrium price, and this is going to be surplus. And if it's set below, it doesn't binding. If you said Walmart, you cannot pay less than $3 to these people, well, it says I'm not do that. I'm paying $3. Why are you telling me not to pay less than $2? Okay, that's the meaning of binding price constraint and not binding price constraint. Okay, price floor, minimum wage, lowest price for labor that any employer may pay, and it was created in 1938. FDR make it to a law, call it Fair Labor Standard Act, which ensures workers a minimally adequate standard of living. Okay. Well, in 2018, federal minimum wage, which is still is $7.25. I think we just passed it to raise it up to $15 an hour. Okay, that's the goal. Well, if you let the market does that, no employee hire anybody in New York, pay him less than probably $15 because people cannot live less than $15 an hour. The employers know that. But some rural area in Texas, maybe a teenager want to work for $5-6 an hour, and they happy, let them do that. That's the argument that classical economists bring in. Let the market take care of this. But it causes a lot of inequality that we already established in previous chapters. The impact of minimum wage mostly on teenage laborers, least skilled workers, low equilibrium wages, willing to accept the lower wage in exchange for on-job training, and minimum wage would be binding if it's set below, if it's set above the equilibrium. Okay, and the statistically shows that a 10% increase in minimum wage depresses the teenage employment between 1 to 3%. Some teenagers who are still attending high school choose to drop out and go get those jobs, assuming they're going to get paid more, and displace other teenagers who had already dropped out of school and who now become unemployed. And these two panel shows here. Okay, that's the market with no intervention, with government regulation. This is the equilibrium wage, and that's how many people are employed. Okay, these people don't want to work with that amount. They out. Okay, and these people here, they don't want to pay that much to hire these people. They out, and these people are in. Okay. Now, if you set the minimum wage above this equilibrium price, which is bounding here, what happened? It causes unemployment, we call it, or surplus. Okay. These people that they were out, now they want to come in to get that job because it's paying better now. But these people that hiring, they're not going to do that. They leave the market, or they're going to lay off people. They're going to operate mean and lean, like Walmart or fast food places and so on. Then, this is just how supply demand model can demonstrate the perfectly competitive market in classical economic model. Then advocate of minimum wage that says raise the income of the working poor. Workers who earn the minimum wage can afford only a meager standard of living. Opponents of the minimum wage, they said, well, it's not the best way to combat poverty. Maybe we find out some other way to do it, because it causes unemployment, encourages teenagers to drop out of school, prevents some unskilled workers from getting on job training, and poorly targeted. And there is another way to do it. We call it a wage subsidy or income subsidy. Okay, you give them tax break and so on. Market are one of those principles we talk about was market usually a good way to organize economic activity. Economists usually oppose price ceiling, price floor. Prices are not outcome of some haphazard process. Prices have the crucial job of balancing supply and demand and coordinating the economic activity. And government can sometimes improve the market outcomes. Like if they want to help the needies, they can do rent subsidies or wage subsidies. Okay, that would be a better way to help them than intervene into the market. The second part is that government intervene into the market is to raise money, use taxes. Okay, government needs to raise revenue for public projects that, private entrepreneur not willing to do that, Although these days making roads now with the cameras and tollways is a good lucrative business, a lot of entrepreneurs might just do that, if the government allowed them. But it used to be government job to making road, railroad, schools, army, and so on. Then how government going to raise taxes? Okay, what do we mean by tax incidence? Is the manner in which the burden of the tax is shared between buyers and sellers. And we're going to show that through our supply demand model. How if the government just imposed tax on sellers? How are we going to show it? Okay, well, sellers, let's say, is the supply of the market for this product. At each point, the marginal sellers here, the price, this shows them their marginal tax. Okay. Now, if the government tell them that you got to pay extra tax to me, then at each point we treat them like an input price goes up. Okay. We previously talked about it, that if input price goes up for those producers, like pizza sauce going to pizza, then you shift the supply curve to the left. Now, tax imposed on sellers makes the supply curve shift to the left. Okay, some suppliers cannot afford to stay in. Supply curve shift left, higher equilibrium price, lower equilibrium quantity. The tax induces the size of the market. It makes the market shrink. Okay, we're going to see it on the graph here. Okay, the blue is demand, supply. Okay, and if government come impose taxes, we can draw that red new supply curve. I would say, okay, I get to the equilibrium, I go up with the tax amount, whatever it is, and from there I draw a parallel line to the old supply curve, and we find a new equilibrium. This is a new equilibrium. And we come down here, okay, that is the new equilibrium quantity, and that is the new equilibrium price, which means the supplier get 330 from the consumers, put aside 50 cents for the government, and they end up with 280. Okay. Then this part goes to the government as a revenue. Okay. As revenue, government get this amount, this rectangular area. Okay. And it shrink the market. Market going to produce less. All right, we're going to see it more down on the other chapters coming. Now, how tax on sellers affect the market outcome? Tax discourage market activity. As we saw, it dropped from 800 unit to 90 unit. Buyers and sellers share the burden of the tax. Although the government intention was just impose 50 cents tax on the sellers, but the burden is divided between them two. Buyers pay more, are worse off, and sellers receive less, and they are worse off. Get the higher price, but pay less, pay the tax. Overall, effective price will fall. How about on the buyers? Okay, let's say this is equilibrium market. Okay, for the buyers, buyers pay this amount. The marginal buyers willing to pay this amount here. Now, you got to pay some of them to the government. Okay, this much got to go to the government. Well, we're going to shift the demand curve down to the left because it's going to cost them more to buy that product. It's just like cigarette. If the government imposed tax on cigarette, then they used to pay, let's say, $2 per pack, no tax. Now, if the government say you got to pay me $3, okay, because I need $1 tax. Well, government does that on cigarette for two reasons: raise the money as a revenue, and also discourage people to smoking cigarettes. And we're going to see this on our model here. Demand curve shift left, lower equilibrium price, lower equilibrium quantity. The tax reduces the size of the market. Okay, we shift the demand curve to the left. This is going to be the new equilibrium compared to this one. And as you see at this here, the market economic activity shrink to 90 from 100, and buyers got to pay extra 50 cents to the sellers. Okay, sellers receive this amount. Okay, pay the government 50 cents. Okay, well, this is going to be the new equilibrium, a new equilibrium here. Okay, now the tax burden is going to be right here. Okay, the seller received now 330. Okay, just like before. put aside 50 cents for government, and sellers end up with 280. Okay, the buyers pay 330 to them, 50 cents put aside for the government, and 280 it would be what the buyers pay. As we see, imposing tax on buyers or sellers, it would be the same outcome. Okay, before we shift the supply curve to the left, we find the upper point. In this case, we shift the demand curve, find the lower point. Okay, in both cases, government making this much money, 50 cents each, and we produce 90 units. 90 multiplied by 50 cents, it's going to be $45 or whatever unit it is. Okay. Then how tax on buyers affect the market outcome? Buyers and sellers share the burden of the tax. Now the question is, the burden on sellers and buyers, how we can calculate that. Okay. Sellers get lower price or worse off. Buyers pay a lower market price or worse off. Effective price with the tax will rises. Tax levied on sellers and tax levied on the buyers are equivalent. The outcome would be equal. The tax wedge between the price that buyer pay and the price that sellers receive, the same regardless of whether the taxes are levied on buyers or the sellers. We shift the relative position of the supply and demand curve, and buyers and sellers share the burden of the tax. Okay. Now the question here is that, can Congress distribute the burden of the tax equally between buyers and sellers? Well, let's say payroll tax deducted from the amount that you earn. You go work, you get a paycheck. They usually say, okay, you made $500. They take 10%, $50 from you. And if they want to charge the firm that pay you $50, the government intention is to divide those tax burden between them equally, but it cannot happen. It depends on elasticity of those two curves. Half of the tax is paid by firms out of the firm's revenue, half tax paid by workers deducted from the paycheck. Payroll tax as a tax on a good, the good is labor and the price is wage. Introducing payroll tax, wage received by workers fall. We just established that in the other market, right? Just treat the labor market the same as a good. The good is the labor and the price is the wage. Wage paid by the firm rises. Workers and firms share the burden, but not necessarily 50-50 as the government intention was. Okay, we're going to see it, what the burden is going to be divided between them, how. Lawmakers can decide whether a tax comes from the buyer's pocket or firm sellers, but cannot legislate the true burden of the tax. Okay, it is determined by the forces of the supply and demand, and those supply and demand, they have different elasticity, different type of goods. Okay, let's look at this market here. If the equilibrium price is here, okay, this is the tax wedge, is only fit between supply and demand in here. Let's say this tax wedge is this much, and this amount here only fit between these 2 points. Okay, now the seller received this much and pay the tax to the government. I'm sorry, the buyers pay this much and pay this much to the government, which is the tax wage right here, okay? And sellers end up with this amount, and this area is the government making the revenue out of it, okay? Now, the burden here, let me just erase it. The burden here, this much comes out of buyer's pocket, and this much comes out of seller's pocket. See, they both used to pay equilibrium price without tax. Okay, buyers paid that much, and seller received that much, and market was in equilibrium. Now buyers pay more, okay, more than what they used to pay. This is the burden goes to them. Sellers receive less than what they used to get paid, and that's going to be the burden to them. Okay, now this two side here, the burden is going to be different if we have different elasticity of these curves. Okay, let's look at them here. Very elastic supply and relatively inelastic demand curve. Sellers bear a small burden of the tax, buyers bear most of the burden. Okay, you can visually see that. Okay, very elastic supply curve, very elastic. Okay, which is more flat. We established that in previous chapter. Fairly and relatively inelastic demand curve. Okay, this is the market equilibrium. If the government imposed tax like this amount here, as you visually see it, the burden is going to be more towards the buyers than sellers. Okay, I don't expect you all memorize this, but you always draw your supply demand curve, relative elastic one, inelastic one, or equal elasticity between them, and see how you can visually see the burden of the tax. Here, the demand curve relatively inelastic is more stiff compared to supply curve. And you will see this burden to the buyers a lot more than to the sellers. What kind of good is that? Okay, that demanders have no choice to buy it. Okay, if the price goes up and down, they have no choice. Remember, those are necessities like a medicine and so on. Okay, the response is not as big as the price changes here in relative to the curve like this. Okay, the burden is going to be just this much. All right. We're going to show you more. Let me just wipe this up here. Okay, let's go back to next one. Here there is a relatively inelastic supply curve, okay, with elastic demand curve, which is more flat compared to the supply. And with this tax amount of, let's say, this size, and this size only fit in here, okay? Remember, to draw these 2 points, you can get the equilibrium, go up with the size of the tax, parallel line to the supply curve, find this point here, okay? And you go down, that's how market is going to shrink, okay? And you find this point, or vice versa. You can go down and parallel line to the demand curve and find this point here. As you notice here, okay, the burden is more to the sellers than the buyers. They're going to get hurt more than the buyers of this product. What kind of product is that? Okay, a luxury item. Demand is more elastic. They don't have to have it. But suppliers of this product, yachts, private airplanes, the workers that making these things, there's not that much flexibility of the supply curve. Okay, you can't bring it, fast enough into the market or drag it out in the market. They are in process of making. If the government tax on this right away, they have no choice but eat up the burden of the tax. All right, these are things you got to consider in using elasticity concept in regard to taxation of the government. The tax burden, okay, then we already established that. It falls more heavily on the side of the market that is less elastic. Small elasticity of demand, buyers do not have good alternative to consuming that's good. Small elasticity of supply, sellers do not have good alternative to producing that good. Okay, just raise this one here. In 1990, Congress adopted a luxury tax on celebrities. Okay, remember Reagan was a celebrity himself. He said, well, these celebrities in Hollywood making too much money, and let me just put a tax on the items that they buy, mostly like luxury, like yachts and private airplane, furs, jewelry, and etc. And the goal was to raise a revenue from those who could most easily afford to pay, right? But guess what? It kind of backfired. The burden mostly comes on the demanders of, suppliers of those items. Okay, remember the demand for luxury is less elastic compared to supplier of those products, and the burden of the tax mostly came out to suppliers of this product rather than the demanders. Demand is quite elastic, supply is relatively inelastic. And then we kind of repeal it after 1993. It didn't work. The burden of the tax falls largely on the suppliers, relatively inelastic supply. All right, we're done with this chapter, and I'll just go ahead and stop it here.